In Israel and Judah's history, there are 43 people who sat on the throne. 42 of these monarchs were kings, but one of these monarchs was a queen. Today we are discussing 2 Chronicles chapter 22 and 23 and the story of the only queen of Judah, Athaliah. Now before we open the text, we need to look at the context. 3,000 years ago, a man named David sat on the throne of Israel. Many Jews and Christians today consider David to be Israel's greatest king. While he sat on the throne, David received a visit from the prophet Nathan. Nathan revealed that God recently spoke to him, and this is what God said to Nathan. David shall build a house for me, and I will establish David's throne forever. I will be a father to David, and he shall be a son to me. I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from him who was before David, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. Now this is a rather stunning promise, and it's known as the Davidic covenant. God pledges to leave a descendant of David on the throne of Israel forever. And when God says forever, Nathan implies that God means forever unconditionally. David's descendants don't have to act or behave a certain way in order to stay on the throne. They simply have to be, and God promised them that as long as they be, then they will stay on the throne. While this pledge from God is exciting, we can also see how this promise can lead to a constant insecurity. Because as long as a descendant of David is on the throne, then it's easy to believe in God. But the minute that someone outside of David's bloodline takes the crown, well, then the entire premise of God is called into question. David eventually dies, and his son Solomon becomes king. Solomon enslaved a massive amount of men and women for profit. This led to his son Rehoboam meeting a rebellion the moment he inherited the crown. A man named Jeroboam led this rebellion and asked King Rehoboam to be a kinder king than his father. King Rehoboam thought about this request from Jeroboam for 3 days. He then returned to Jeroboam and said, "Nah, I'm going to be a worse king than my dad was, and I'm going to enslave you more." Needless to say, Jeroboam's rebellion did not appreciate these remarks. So Jeroboam's rebellion seceded from the union and formed a new nation with 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. They established the capital city of Samaria and crowned Jeroboam as their first king. Because they had the majority of the tribes of Israel with them, they also took the name Israel with them. Rehoboam's kingdom became known as Judah. Of course, this secession did not come about in a peaceful manner. A bloody and terrible civil war ensued that lasted for 60 years. During that civil war, Rehoboam's son Abijah became the king of Judah and continued the war of his father against Jeroboam. Abijah and Jeroboam then died near the same time, which led to Jeroboam's son Nadab succeeding his father on the throne, while Asa became the king of Judah in the south. Asa ruled the kingdom of Judah for over 40 years, while Nadab and the northern kingdom of Israel entered into a tumultuous era. A man named Baasha assassinated King Nadab, and Baasha then ruled for 24 years before his death. This led to his son Elah being crowned as king, but he reigned for only a year before a man named Zimri assassinated him. Zimri lasted just 7 days on the throne of Israel before Omri seized Zimri and lit him on fire. Omri reigned for about 12 years before he died, and his son Ahab rose to power as the king of Israel. About that time, Asa passed away, and Judah coronated his son Jehoshaphat as the new king of Judah. Now Jehoshaphat had a son named Jehoram, and Jehoshaphat knew that Ahab had at least 3 children, Athaliah, Ahaziah, and Jehoram. In my imagination, Jehoshaphat looked at the civil war that raged for 6 decades and thought to himself, "I'm tired of fighting. What's all of this bloodshed for? This civil war began between the house of my ancestor Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Jeroboam's family isn't even close to the throne anymore. With some of that thought process in mind, Jehoshaphat approached King Ahab and said, "You have a daughter, Athaliah, and I have a son, Jehoram. Why don't we make a marriage alliance between our families and bring an end to this civil war?" Ahab agreed. And in 2 Chronicles 18, we read that a marriage alliance, the first alliance between these two nations since the secession under the rule of Rehoboam. Shortly after the consummation of this marriage alliance, Ahab died at the hand of the Arameans in the Battle of Ramoth-Gilead, which we discussed last week. After his death, his son Ahaziah began to reign, but he died shortly thereafter because he fell through a guardrail on a balcony. Ahaziah's brother, Jehoram, took his place as king. While King Jehoram is on the throne of Israel, Jehoshaphat died, which meant that a different king with the same name, Jehoram, began to reign on the throne of Judah. Now we can read about King Jehoram of Judah. We can read about the King Jehoram of Judah, the southern kingdom, becoming king in 2 Chronicles 21. We read, Jehoram had brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, and Shaphat. I can't say that one. All these were the sons of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. A few verses later, we find out what Jehoram did to these 5 brothers. We read, when Jehoram had ascended to the throne of his father and was established, he put all of his brothers to the sword, and also some of the officials of Israel. Yeesh. Many consider Asa and Jehoshaphat to be great kings. But as soon as Jehoshaphat dies, his son Jehoram murders Jehoshaphat's 6 other sons to have a clear path to power. To try and explain why someone might be so violent, the author of Chronicles explains. This author writes, Jehoram walked in the way of the kings of Israel as the house of Ahab had done. For the daughter of Ahab, Athaliah, was his wife. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the author blames Jehoshaphat's marriage alliance and in turn Jehoram's wife for the unspeakable cruelty of Jehoram toward his siblings. The author then adds a comment, yet the Lord would not destroy the house of David, because of the covenant that he had made with David, and since he had promised to give a lamp to him and to his descendants forever. This is a reference to the Davidic covenant that we talked about at the beginning of this sermon. However, even though God keeps her promises, the author felt that Jehoram deserved a strong rebuke from the prophet Elijah. Elijah wrote a letter to Jehoram condemning him for murdering his 6 brothers. In this letter, Elijah tells Jehoram how God will punish him for these homicides. Elijah writes, "The Lord will bring a great plague on your people, your children, your wives, and all your possessions. And you yourself will have a severe sickness with a disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out, day after day, because of this disease." Okay, Elijah, that sounds awful. And it was awful, because Elijah's prophecy of punishment came to pass. After all this, the Lord struck Jehoram in the bowels with an incurable disease. In course of time, at the end of 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. Now, I'm not a medical expert, but my brother, Scotty, is. I asked him to diagnose King Jehoram based on the text. He told me, this sounds like a rectal prolapse. I then asked him to describe what a rectal prolapse is, and that, my friends, was a mistake. Not only that, but Scotty then sent me a picture of a rectal prolapse. Why? That image is now permanently scorched on my retinas. After a complete medical description of a rectal prolapse, Scotty finally wrapped it up by saying, a rectal prolapse would be a terrible way to die in the ancient world. Moving on. After Jehoram's death, his son Ahaziah, named after his uncle that fell from the balcony, began to rule over Judah. Now King Ahaziah's other uncle, King Jehoram of Israel, asked for King Ahaziah's help in fighting off an insurrection from a man named Jehu. So King Ahaziah of Judah rushed to King Jehoram's aid to meet Jehu in battle. But Jehu possessed speedy chariots, and both kings fell at the hand of Jehu in one day. Ahaziah reigned for just 1 year, and he died at the age of 23. And even though Ahaziah was young, he had a son and heir apparent named Joash. Now you might assume that Joash would be crowned as the new king of Judah, but there's a bit of a problem with Joash. He's just 1 year old. It's hard to step up to the throne when you can't even walk. And after Ahaziah of Judah's death, there is a vacuum of power in the land of Judah. The power vacuum inspires Ahaziah's mother, Athaliah, to pursue the crown with blunt force. We read, when Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she set about to destroy all the royal family of the house of Judah. And when the author of Chronicles says, all the house of Judah, he means all the house of Judah, including her 1 year old grandson, the heir apparent, Joash. However, Athaliah's daughter, Jehoshabeth, intervenes. We read, but Jehoshabeth, the king's daughter, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's children who were about to be killed, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Somehow, someway, Jehoshabeth managed to smuggle baby Joash out of Jerusalem despite the rage of her own matriarch. With Joash gone, Athaliah becomes the reigning queen of Judah. Now, this is a problem for the author of Chronicles for two reasons. The first problem is that Athaliah is a woman. And you don't have to read very far in the book of Chronicles to understand that its author views women as deeply inferior to men. The second problem is that Athaliah is the first reigning monarch of Judah to not be directly related to David. Remember, God promised David that his descendants would reign on the throne of Judah forever. Just her title, Queen Athalia, represented a broken promise from God. Because of the intersectionality of her gender and her heritage, the author of Chronicles does not recognize her time on the throne as legitimate. He does this in subtle ways. When the author of Chronicles introduces the 8 kings of Judah that preceded Athaliah, the author states the king's age and when they first wore the crown, as well as the year that that king began to reign. However, when Athaliah becomes queen, the author of Chronicles does not state her age or the year that she began to reign. Instead, she is treated as a disposable obstacle between the reign of Ahaziah and his son Joash. Despite all of these things, Athaliah reigns on the throne for 6 years. One day, she is sitting in her palace throne room. I assume she is, how does one say this? Slaying it. When all of a sudden she hears outside of her walls, "Here is the king's son. Let him reign as the Lord promised concerning the sons of David." When Athaliah heard the noise of people running and praising the king, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and the singers with their musical instruments leading in their celebration. Now notice how the author here does not hesitate to refer to Joash, a 7-year-old boy, mind you, as the king. In his mind, Joash has been on the throne this whole time, and God has kept God's promises. Upon seeing her grandson for the first time in 6 years, Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason! Treason!" Immediately, the mob laid hands on her. She went into the entrance of the horse gate of the king's house, and there they put her to death. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been killed with the sword. And with that, the story of Queen Athalia comes to a close. Now, the story of Queen Athalia is a barbaric story. A grandmother attempts to murder her 1-year-old grandson. A granddaughter betrays her grandmother, and a 7-year-old grandson is escorted back to Jerusalem as a prop to justify the murder of his grandmother. This story is not light devotional reading. There's not a quick and easy lesson that can be taken from Queen Athalia's life. We can't really hold her up as a hero because, she attempted to murder a baby. And if you're wondering where Paradox stands on the whole murdering babies debate, allow me to put all of the rumors to rest once and for all and say very clearly, murdering babies is a sin. So what do we do with the barbaric story of Queen Athalia? My hunch is that most of you felt a fair amount of disgust at the gruesome nature of Athalia's actions. But how many of you felt the same amount of disgust when I told you the story of her husband, Jehoram, securing the throne of Judah? Because Jehoram did the exact same thing that Athaliah did. He murdered each and every one of his brothers to ensure unrivaled power. And when the text says that Jehoram put his brothers to the sword, it's a fair assumption to read into the text that Jehoram also put his brothers' families, including all of their babies, to the sword as well. When we read the story of Queen Athalia, we must remember that Jehoram and Athaliah commit the exact same sins. Did you feel an equal amount of disgust and repulsion for Jehoram's violence as you did for Athaliah's violence? Are you just as angry at Jehoram for his abuse of power as you are at Athaliah for her abuse of power? Or do you feel that Athaliah should intuitively know better or instinctively act different because of her gender? Because she is the only queen in all of Judah and Israel's history, her story and our reaction can teach us something about our own biases. If we hold Athaliah to a higher ethical standard than the other kings of Judah, then we are participating in the sin of sexism. If we feel that Athaliah should somehow play by different rules because of her femininity, even though she's playing in a world created by men, then we are unfairly discriminating against her and against women. Jehoram and Athaliah commit the same sins. Therefore, they require the same condemnation. So, with that in mind, we have to keep this lesson when we go back through Judah's history. Because 250 years before Athaliah became the queen of Judah, Israel was a united nation living under the rule of King Solomon. Now, Solomon is considered by many to be Israel's wisest king. But what very few Christians know is that before Solomon ruled, is that King David had an older son than Solomon named Adonijah. Now, most of us know how monarchies work. The oldest son is crowned king after his father passes away. Now, you may ask how I know that this is true, and it's because I once watched a documentary film called The Lion King. In that movie, Simba sings about how he just can't wait to be king because he's his father's oldest son. Now, this song is particularly strange because when he says, "I can't wait to be king," he is essentially saying that he just can't wait for his dad to die. And when you consider that that's what that song is really about, it really drains the emotional potency out of this scene. So when David dies, everyone assumes that his oldest son, Adonijah, will be the king. But Solomon wants to be the king. So much so that he sends assassins to murder his brother Adonijah. In addition, it's safe to assume that he also murdered all of Adonijah's house to ensure that no one would later rise up against him and challenge his authority. And after all of Adonijah's house is killed, the younger son, Solomon, then becomes the king of Israel. Solomon commits the same sin as Athaliah. Now, what's interesting to me about all of this is that I know loads of Christians who tell me about how they admire Solomon. They strive for his wisdom. They desire his passion for justice. and they quote what they believe to be his proverbs from Scripture. But no one talks about the fact that he assassinated his brother. Why is it that we are willing to overlook the sins of Solomon, but not the sins of Athaliah? They are the same sins. And if this sounds like I'm trying to gloss over the fact that Athaliah attempted to murder her grandson, may I remind you about what we believe at this church. Murdering babies is a sin. Throughout my life, I've heard Christians say, I want to have wisdom like Solomon. But if a Christian said, I want to have confidence like Athaliah, most Christians would respond in horror and say, what are you talking about? Athaliah is evil. She murdered her own family. And the fact that she committed that sin disqualifies Athaliah from being a role model. And that same sin is what is completely forgotten about when qualifying Solomon as a role model. If a sin disqualifies Athaliah from being a role model, then that same sin must disqualify Solomon from being a role model as well. Otherwise, we are participating in the sin of sexism. This is discrimination if we don't pay attention to this. This is what misogyny is. This is ultimately a sin. And we must be aware of it because this is something that happens day in and day out within Christianity. We must be willing to disqualify people regardless of their gender for the same sins or not disqualify them at all. This is the sin of sexism. End of story. But it's not the end of the story, is it? Because Solomon was not the first king in all of Israel's history to murder others to secure the throne. His father, King David, rose to power while there was another king already sitting on the throne of Israel. That king's name was Saul. Shortly after Saul's death, Israel crowned Saul's oldest living son, Ishbal, as the second king of their young nation. Immediately, David declared war with Ishbal because he wanted the crown. This war went on for many years. Many people died attacking and defending the throne. As the war began to wind down and David's victory began to feel imminent, 2 assassins from David's tribe snuck into the royal palace and murdered King Ishbal. These 2 assassins then returned to David and presented him with the head of Ishbal. While we assume that David would be elated to see that his enemy is dead, he instead ordered the immediate execution of his own assassins. He does this to make a political statement about anyone who dares to kill a king, because David knows that he is about to be king. Yes, it's true. David is a ruthless king. Before he is crowned as king, though, David then goes and arrests Saul's 2 remaining sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, as well as 5 of Saul's grandsons. David kept these 7 men in prison for decades. This came to an end in 2 Samuel 21 when a tribe from Gibeon felt that they were wronged by Saul in the past. The Gibeonites then asked David to hand over the imprisoned descendants of Saul so that they can murder them in vengeance. David agreed. And the Gibeonites took the 7 men out of prison for the first time in decades up to a mountain and impaled each of them one by one. Now, one thing that I failed to mention at the beginning of David's story is that David is Saul's son-in-law. David kills all of these people, which are his in-laws, his family. And David commits the same sin as Athaliah. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that I know loads of Christians who tell me about how much they admire David. They want courage like David. They want a close relationship with God like David. They want to compose songs like David. But no one talks about the multiple murders of his in-laws that David committed to consolidate power. Why are we willing to overlook the sins of David, but not the sins of Athaliah? Now, I'm not saying that we should make Athaliah a role model because remember, murdering babies is a sin, but I am saying that if a sin disqualifies Athaliah from being a role model, then that same sin must disqualify David from being a role model. Otherwise, we are participating in the sin of sexism. Now, some may be quick to point out that I'm discounting all of the other good things that David and Solomon did with their lives. What about the Psalms? What about the Proverbs? What about the time that David sought forgiveness for the other murder he committed? Now, some may also point out that all that we know about Athaliah is that she murdered her family for the crown. Maybe the critic might say, if she did something else with her time on the throne, something good, then we could find some level of redemption in her story. But is there any way to redeem multiple murders in exchange for a crown? I don't think there is. No matter how much good these three did while they reigned over Israel, Judah, it seems nearly impossible to make me feel like it's okay to murder your family in order to govern. Now, you may think I'm crazy for believing that it's impossible to redeem these murders, but I'm not alone in this belief. The author of Chronicles believes the same thing as me. This author's central purpose for writing 1st and 2nd Chronicles is to establish the centrality and importance of the temple in their region. Because the temple is the author's agenda when writing these books, he wants the reader to know that the two builders of the temple, David and Solomon, are the most moral and upstanding people in Israel's history. Which is a bit of a problem, because, they murdered their family members for a crown. So how does the author of Chronicles present David and Solomon as exemplars of morality when they have a plethora of blood on their hands? Well, let me show you how the author does it. David and Solomon ruled over Israel sometime between the 10th and 9th century BCE. 400 years later, a historian writes the history of the kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. These 4 books contain the stories of David's cruelty toward his in-laws and the story of Solomon murdering his brother Adonijah, as well as all of Adonijah's family. 200 years after that history is written down, or 600 years after David and Solomon lived, another author writes 1st and 2nd Chronicles with an agenda of making the temple great again. This agenda shapes the historical narrative of the Chronicles. And this reshaping of the story leads Chronicles further away from historical fact and closer toward religious propaganda. So to tell the world about the sterling reputation of the temple, the author of Chronicles recalls the stories of Saul's death in chapter 10 of 1 Chronicles. And in the very next verse, he writes about David ascending to the throne. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. Now hold on a second. Where is Ishbal? Wasn't there a civil war for David to become king that lasted for years? Now we read Chronicles and all of Israel just peacefully comes together, skips over Saul's son Ishbal, and crowns David together in perfect harmony? What about locking up 2 of Saul's sons and 5 grandsons and offering them as a sacrifice to the Gibeonites? None of those stories or people are mentioned in Chronicles. Why not? Because the author of Chronicles knows that those historical facts will call into question David's character, which is why the author completely omits Ishbal, Armoni, Mephibosheth, and Saul's 5 grandchildren from the narrative. Solomon's rise to power follows a similar pattern in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, in this telling of Solomon's rise to power, there is no mention of Solomon's older brother Adonijah in the last part of Chronicles. Instead, David, while he is still alive, lets all of Israel know that his younger son Solomon is supposed to be his heir. There is no mention of David's pronouncement in Samuel or Kings. It only shows up in Chronicles. If that wasn't enough, David announces this again at the end of 1 Chronicles that Solomon, the younger son, is to succeed him as king. This second pronouncement is followed by a second coronation when we read, they made David's son Solomon king a second time. Really? We need to make him king twice? There is something telling in the way that the history of David and Solomon is recorded in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The author of Chronicles knows that the murders committed by David and Solomon to gain the crown are irredeemable. So he omits them. He omits them so that his readers can believe that David and Solomon, the visionaries, the founders, and the builders of the temple, can hold these two kings up as heroes of the faith. But the author of Chronicles still wants his readers to believe that Athaliah is a villain. So he makes sure to include the very sin he was willing to omit for David and Solomon in an effort to make his readers believe that she is beyond redemption. Chronicles discriminates against Athaliah by holding her accountable for the same sin that is deliberately forgotten to protect the reputations of David and Solomon. We must be aware of this whenever we read the books of Kings and Chronicles. Today, when we hold up David and Solomon as heroes of the faith, while simultaneously condemning Athaliah for the same behavior, we are participating in the sin of sexism. And this very sin of sexism was committed by the author of Chronicles in the way that he recorded history. That sin is contained in Scripture. Now, there's nothing wrong with the fact that there's sin being contained in Scripture, as long as we are willing to admit it. This acceptance of sins within the Bible is difficult for some of us because of our definition of what the Bible is. Many people of faith believe that the Bible is a moral code hand-delivered to us by God. But I can tell you that after I've dedicated my life to the study of these scriptures, I can testify to the shortcomings of that definition. The discrimination against Queen Athalia is one of many examples I would cite to point out the problems of holding up the Bible as a moral authority. Personally, I found that the Bible is much more helpful when I hold it up as a mirror. That way, when I encounter a sin within Scripture, like the sin of the author of Chronicles, the Bible gives me an opportunity to see that sin in myself and then to work to fight against that so I don't fall to the same temptation again. In a world filled with finger-pointing, blaming, and longing to prove that those other people are the problem, the Bible dares us to look inward and ask ourselves the daunting question: how am I part of the problem? And when it comes to the story of Queen Athalia, and the fact that she is the only woman out of 43 monarchs, it's safe to assume that this story can teach us about the way that we view women, particularly women who are in power. Which is precisely why I wanted to talk to you about Athaliah today. On Tuesday, for the first time in American history, we elected a woman to serve as Vice President of the United States. No matter what your politics are, we need to appreciate the importance of this moment in our society. Our second Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, enslaved 600 men and women of African descent during his lifetime. One of these women, Sally Hemings, he kept as a sex slave. Jefferson most likely began sleeping with her when he was 44 and she was just 14. She gave birth to at least 4 of his children throughout her lifetime. And now, in January of 2021, a black woman whom Jefferson would have sought to enslave during his lifetime will sit in the same seat of power where Jefferson once ruled. if you consider yourself to be even a remote enthusiast of American history, it is impossible for partisan politics to rob you and I of the beauty of this moment, from Sally Hemings to Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, because this is the first time in our nation's history that we are willing to trust a woman with this kind of power, and it's long overdue, it means that none of us know how to act in the way that we talk about and respond to her actions as vice president. Because with great power comes a great deal of criticism. And that criticism is necessary and important because it keeps power in check. And when you look at the life of Jesus Christ, one consistent theme throughout his time here on earth was that he was constantly critical of people who abused their power. However, the story of Athaliah can teach us about how we respond to women who are in power. What it teaches us is that when Vice President Harris does something that you or I deem to be irresponsible or immoral, all of us, myself included, need to pause before we criticize her and ask ourselves an important question. Have I been critical of a man for doing the same thing? If the answer is no, then we repeat the sin of Chronicles. Now, if you and I are serious about personal growth and experiencing transformation from a relationship with Jesus Christ, we'll take this question one step further. We'll ask the question, have I been critical of a man from the political party that I generally agree with for doing the same thing? Or have you and I been willing to overlook the same sin in a man to advance our own agenda, our own power, our own finances, and or our own family? Because if we have, then we repeat the sin of Chronicles. The story of Queen Athalia is much bigger than how we view just one woman in power. Because we live in a world that was primarily built by men, for men, at the expense of oppressing women. Therefore, in today's society of the patriarchy, the story of Queen Athalia should give all of us pause whenever we are critical of another woman. Whether she is our boss, our classmate, our teacher, our student, our friend, or our daughter. We must always pause and ask ourselves if we have been willing to overlook their same sin in a man. Because to overlook that transgression from a man while criticizing that same transgression from a woman is to repeat the sin of Chronicles. To my brothers, my sisters, and my friends, the work of gender equality is the work of God. May we cease to repeat the sin of Chronicles, and may we see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, particularly in the feminine experience. Amen.